The bouncer's hand was still on Mike Tyson's shoulder when he realized something was wrong. Not wrong with the situation, wrong with his hand. It wasn't moving. He'd grabbed this man's shoulder the way he'd grabbed 100 shoulders before, firm, authoritative, the grip that said you're going where I tell you to go. And it wasn't moving. He pulled harder. Nothing. That's when he looked down at his own wrist and saw Mike's hand wrapped around it. The grip wasn't aggressive, wasn't violent. It was just there, completely immovable, with the particular quality of something that had been built over decades rather than grown. 3 seconds later, the bouncer's back was against the wall, his legs still trying to figure out how he'd gotten there, and every person in the VIP section of that club had stopped what they were doing to watch. Mike Tyson hadn't thrown a single punch. The story of what happened in those 3 seconds would spread through every nightclub in Manhattan within a week. Security staff would tell it to new hires for years, and the bouncer at the center of it, a man named Derek, 6 feet 4 inches, 260 pounds, former college football player, would spend the rest of his life describing the moment he learned the difference between thinking you're powerful and actually being powerful. To understand how a routine night out turned into a 3-second lesson that became Manhattan nightclub legend, we need to go back to the beginning of that evening. It was the early 1990s, Manhattan. Mike had been training hard for weeks, the kind of camp that consumed everything: morning runs before the city woke up, afternoons in the gym, evenings studying tape. He was the heavyweight champion of the world, and being the heavyweight champion of the world meant that almost every hour of every day belonged to something or someone other than himself. Tonight was different. A few hours with people from the gym, a drink, some music, the particular luxury of being somewhere loud enough that nobody expected conversation. Just normal. Just invisible for a few hours. That was all he wanted. The club was the kind of place that existed in early 90s Manhattan the way certain things only exist in certain cities at certain times. Packed, expensive, the kind of spot where the music was right and the crowd was a mix of people who'd earned their way in and people who'd bought their way in, and you couldn't always tell the difference. Athletes, musicians, people adjacent to both. The kind of room where being recognized was both inevitable and somehow manageable, because everyone there had their own version of famous to worry about. Mike had arrived with 3 people from the gym. They'd gone through the front without issue. The door staff had recognized him immediately. The velvet rope had moved. They'd been walked to a booth in the VIP section without any conversation required. Mike had settled in, ordered something to drink, started to decompress. For about 40 minutes, it worked. Nobody crowded him. Nobody wanted anything. He was just a person in a room with music and people and no obligations for a few hours. Then he went to the bathroom. It was a small thing, an ordinary thing. He excused himself, made his way through the crowd, was gone maybe 5 minutes. What he didn't know was that while he was gone, the shift changed. Derek had been working the door and VIP section at this club for 6 months. He was 24 years old, recently finished with college football when an injury ended what he'd hoped would be a professional career, and he'd taken the security job because it paid reasonably, and it suited something in his personality that liked having authority in a room. He was good at his job, mostly. He was big enough that most situations resolved themselves before they started. He'd learned to read crowds, learned which confrontations to absorb and which to escalate, learned the particular skill of making someone feel controlled without making them feel humiliated. He had a future in this industry if he was careful. He had one weakness, and it was the same weakness that undoes a lot of people who work in authority roles at a young age. He needed people to know he was in charge, not maliciously, not consciously even. But somewhere in Derek's understanding of his job was the belief that his authority had to be visible at all times, that any challenge to it, even an accidental one, had to be addressed immediately and physically. Because if you let one person walk past you without permission, then the whole architecture of control you'd built started to crumble. He came on shift, got his briefing from the outgoing staff, took his position near the VIP entrance. He didn't get a complete rundown of everyone already seated inside. There were 20, 30 people in the VIP section. He was told the important names, but not all of them. Mike Tyson's name somehow didn't make it to Derek's ears before Mike came back from the bathroom. Derek saw him approach the VIP rope, short, compact, no visible pass, no entourage, walking like he owned the room. Something about that walk bothered Derek immediately. It was the walk of someone who didn't think they needed permission for anything, and in Derek's experience, that walk needed to be addressed. He stepped forward, put his hand on Mike's shoulder, firm, the grip that said, "Stop." Mike stopped. The music kept playing. People kept dancing. The room had no idea that anything was happening in this corner of it. Derek leaned down. "VIP's restricted access. You got a pass?" His voice was the voice he'd practiced, authoritative, loud enough to establish dominance, carrying the assumption of compliance built into its tone. Mike turned his head slowly, looked up at Derek. He didn't say anything. He just looked. Here's what Derek didn't understand yet. Mike Tyson had grown up in Brownsville. He'd been in juvenile detention before he was a teenager. He'd spent his adolescence in gyms and group homes and environments where the rules were written in a language that had nothing to do with velvet ropes and security shirts. He had spent his entire life learning to read situations the way other people learn to read text, instinctively, completely, in fractions of seconds. And what he read in this situation was very simple. A man who didn't know who he was had put his hands on him without cause. That man was operating from the assumption that his size and his shirt gave him the right to physically control strangers. That assumption was wrong. And the only question was how wrong Mike was going to let it be. In a different version of Mike Tyson, an earlier version, an angrier version, the answer would have been very wrong. The kind of wrong that ended with ambulances and lawyers. But Mike had been thinking about control for years by this point, about the difference between what he was capable of and what situations actually required, about the gap between ego and intelligence and how most people lived their entire lives unable to find it. He'd found it, he lived in it, and he was about to demonstrate it. His left hand came up. The movement was casual, almost lazy. He brought it up and wrapped his fingers around Derek's wrist, the wrist connected to the hand still gripping his shoulder, with the relaxed ease of someone picking up a coffee cup. Derek felt it, and his instinct was to pull back. He was 260 pounds. He'd moved people twice his age without effort. He pulled. His arm didn't move. At all. Not an inch. Not a fraction. It was like pulling against a wall that had decided not to move. Derek's brain sent the instruction, his muscles responded, and nothing happened. He pulled harder. Still nothing. The hand around his wrist wasn't squeezing, wasn't gripping aggressively. It was simply there, and it had apparently decided that Derek's arm was going to stay exactly where it was. The confusion that crossed Derek's face in that moment was visible from 6 feet away. Then Mike moved. One motion, smooth, practiced, the product of 10,000 repetitions of understanding how bodies work and what happens when leverage is applied correctly. He rotated his torso, brought Derek's arm down and forward in a single controlled arc. 260 pounds of muscle discovered that weight means almost nothing when someone understands angles. Derek's balance broke. His body followed his arm whether he wanted it to or not. He stumbled forward, his height working against him now, his center of gravity suddenly all wrong. He was bending at the waist, his face dropping from a foot above Mike's to directly at eye level. Mike's right hand was already in position. Open palm, center of Derek's chest. He pushed. Not a strike, not a punch, just a push, firm, complete, utterly final. The kind of push that communicated everything without violence. Derek went backward, 3 steps, 4, his feet scrambling under him trying to find purchase that wasn't there anymore. His shoulders found the wall behind him. The impact rattled 2 framed photographs. He stood there, back against the wall, breathing hard, trying to process the last 3 seconds. The music was still playing, but the VIP section had gone quiet. Every person within 30 feet had seen it, had seen this enormous security guard grab a shorter man's shoulder and end up against the wall without a punch thrown, without a sound made, without anything that looked like a fight from the outside. Just 3 seconds of very efficient education. Other security staff were moving now. 2 more guards and the floor manager, a man named Tony who'd worked this club for 8 years and knew every face that mattered in this room. Tony saw Mike standing in the VIP section, completely composed, saw Derek against the wall, still working on breathing. Recognition arrived in Tony's face like cold water. He moved fast. "Mr. Tyson." His voice was controlled, but the urgency was audible underneath it. "I'm so sorry. This is new staff. He wasn't briefed correctly. This is completely our fault." Mike looked at Derek, still against the wall, still processing. Tony turned to Derek, his voice dropping an octave. "Apologize. Now." Derek pushed himself off the wall. His legs were steadier than his expression. He'd spent 6 months building confidence in this room, and 3 seconds had taken something out of it that he could feel the absence of, even if he couldn't name it yet. "I'm sorry, Mr. Tyson." His voice came out smaller than he wanted it to. "I didn't recognize you. I was just—" "You put your hands on someone you didn't know," Mike said. His voice was quiet, calm, almost gentle, which somehow made it land heavier than if he'd been angry. "Without asking, without cause. That's not doing your job." Mike paused. "That's ego. There's a difference." Derek had no answer for that. He nodded, looked at the floor. Tony made a decision. "Downstairs, we'll talk." Derek walked past Mike without making eye contact and disappeared toward the stairs. Tony turned back. "Please, anything tonight, on us, whatever you need." Mike shook his head. "I already paid, I just want to finish my drink." He walked back to his booth, sat down, picked up his glass. His friends were staring at him. One of them laughed, low and disbelieving. "You didn't even hit him." Mike took a sip. "Didn't need to." His friend was quiet for a second. "But you could have." Mike set the glass down. "That's the point. Showing someone what you could do without doing it teaches more than actually doing it." He looked across the room. He'll remember those 3 seconds for the rest of his life. If I'd hit him, he'd just have a story about getting punched. This way, he has a lesson. Tony came back to the table 30 minutes later. "I wanted to let you know, Derek is no longer employed here." His voice was professional, careful. "He violated basic protocol. Regardless of who the guest is, you do not physically initiate contact without cause. That's immediate termination." Mike looked up. "You didn't have to fire him." Tony shook his head. "Yes, I did. The fact that it was you makes it worse, but honestly, it would be the same if it was anyone. You don't grab people." Mike nodded, said nothing else. Tony left. The rest of the night was quiet the way good nights are quiet. Music, conversation, the gradual unwinding of weeks of training camp. Mike left around 2 in the morning, got in his car, drove home through empty streets. One of his friends brought it up on the drive. "You know what gets me? The way you just moved him, like it was nothing." "It was nothing," Mike said, eyes on the road. "He thought his size gave him control. I showed him it didn't. That's all that happened." "He's going to think about that for a long time." "Probably," Mike said. "Whether he learns the right thing from it is up to him." By morning, the story was in 3 boroughs. Not the exaggerated version, or not only that version. The accurate one spread too, because the accurate one was better than any exaggeration. A 260-pound security guard had grabbed Mike Tyson's shoulder and ended up against the wall in 3 seconds without a punch thrown. Within a week, every club in Manhattan had heard it. Security staff passed it between themselves the way cautionary tales get passed, with the particular attention that comes when a story has something real to teach. Tony used it in training sessions at the next club he managed. Same story, same point, every time he brought on new staff. The lesson was always the same. Respect costs nothing. Pride costs everything. Derek went home that night and couldn't sleep. He kept replaying it. The wrist, the grip that didn't move, the ease of what happened after. He'd spent 6 months believing that his size made him powerful. 3 seconds had shown him the distance between believing something and it being true. He didn't work security again. Within 2 weeks, the calls had stopped coming. Word had spread the way word spreads in industries where everyone knows everyone. Years later, Derek would tell the story himself, not the version where he looked stupid, the version where he learned something. He'd tell it to anyone who'd listen, frame it the way people frame things once they've had enough time and distance to find the meaning in them. Real power doesn't announce itself, he'd say. Real power doesn't need to prove anything. I thought my size made me strong. Mike showed me that strength is about control, about knowing the difference between what you can do and what you should do. He could have ended me with one punch. Instead, he gave me 3 seconds of the most efficient education I've ever received. I've never forgotten it. Mike Tyson was at a Manhattan nightclub when a security guard who didn't recognize him grabbed his shoulder and tried to remove him from the VIP section. 3 seconds later, the guard was against the wall. No punches, no raised voices, no aggression, just 3 seconds of demonstration, the kind that only comes from someone who has spent their entire life building the gap between what they're capable of and what the situation requires. Derek lost his job that night, not because of Mike, because of what his actions said about his judgment, his instincts, his understanding of a basic rule that no amount of size can substitute for. Respect costs nothing. The lesson took 3 seconds to deliver. It took Derek considerably longer to understand it, but he understood it eventually. And maybe that's what made it worth it.